one feature of this Brexit vote that commentators remarked a lot on, but could easily be lost in the months coming, is the fact that it was close. It was basically 52 for Leave and 48 for Remain. The overall turnout was massive in terms of recent British political history. It was over 70%. And so but because it was that large, the turnout, it was seen very much as a mandate, even though what separated the two sides was about 1.5 million votes. And there were patterns to the who was voting Leave and who was voting Remain. The regional patterns were pretty clear immediately, namely that in Scotland and in London, more than 60% voted to remain in the European Union. You had similar figures in some of the more cosmopolitan cities of the UK, Bristol, Manchester, the Oxford, Cambridge. But when you move away from those areas, there were some surprises. So, for example, areas that would have traditionally voted Labour, let's say, actually had quite a large percentage of people who were voting to leave. I mean, one place that comes to mind, Sheffield, but even in places like Newcastle, which has a very high academic population, the Remain side won very narrowly. So this raises a lot of interesting questions about how is the vote this way, because it was really quite polarized, you might say. That basically the Remain side was very strong in very concentrated areas, but if you're looking at the vast range of the country, the Leave side has a kind of broader sort of support, it seems. Well, first of all, there are two statistics that are worth keeping in mind here. The first one is that if you look at age cohort, so you start from the very old and you go down to the very young, voter turnout decreases systematically. Every 10 years, younger, decrease in turnout. At the same time, of course, you see that, again, doing the ages, the likelihood of voting Leave is greater the older you are. Okay? So one conclusion to draw is, and already people who study public opinion have already drawn this conclusion, namely that had the young people turned out to vote in the proportions that the older people turned out to vote, then Remain would have won. That's pretty clear. Nevertheless, this does point to points to two issues. One issue, I think that, an issue that people have talked about for a long time is the fact that the young people, despite their, periodic moments of protest on various selected topics, actually do not have a consistent enough relationship with the political structure to actually feel it their civic duty to vote on successive elections. That's a real problem. It was not invented by this referendum. It's been around for a long time, and it's not just in Britain, it's across the world. But the other problem, which I think is quite a substantial problem, which is revealed by the referendum, is the fact that attitudes to the European Union really differ according to age. With younger people, who have kind of spent their whole lives in the European Union, as it were, for them, it kind of opens Britain up to a kind of larger space where it's easier to move around, learn about new things, do new things, maybe even get new jobs, move, so forth. So it ends the kind of claustrophobic island sensibility that one might otherwise associate with Britain and some in terms of Little England and stuff like that. That Europe has in a way been very much an antidote to that. And I could tell you, I was first a student in this country, in the late 1970s, and the way in which the whole demeanor of the place has changed from then to now is tremendous. I mean, there was a much more obvious Little Englander way of being in the country when I was a student at Cambridge, but not anymore. And I think young people who've always kind of grown up with this more cosmopolitan Britain don't want to see it disappear. And that's what they're afraid of if Britain were to leave the European Union. Now, the older people, well, as I was saying, the older people see the immigrants coming into their towns. They have this view, which is really not based on fact, that the immigrants are sucking up resources, that they're putting a strain on the system. Again, I think where this is probably most true is in terms of housing, but everything else, I don't think there's no evidence for that. But nevertheless, just their presence, and the fact they don't speak English. And also, I think there are some unfortunate resonances about World War II and, other issues where Britain has had, somewhat mixed relationships with Europe over the course of history that I think play into the kind of imaginary that the older people are drawing on. And so I think you basically, what you're seeing here is a kind of generational conflict of worldviews that are being manifested by this Brexit vote. And this is something that's not going to be very easy to deal with. And I think it is a worldview level thing. It's an ideological thing. Because as I've been saying already, I don't think this is really based on hard empirical fact. So, for example, one statistic that popped out after the referendum vote was that that 9 out of the 10 regions that receive the most money from the EU, because they are regarded as poor regions, voted for Brexit. Okay? Because one of the things that the European Union does with all of this money that we and all the other countries put into it is they basically redistribute it. So it's a kind of giant welfare scheme, essentially, the European Union. And so the parts of the European Union that are poor or seen as relatively disadvantaged from an economic or social standpoint, money automatically gets pumped in. And it gets pumped in directly from Europe without having to deal with Parliament and the local politics and stuff like this. And so a lot of the north of England, Wales, by the way, people were a little surprised, voted to leave. Northern Ireland, which voted to remain, but narrowly. I mean, all of these places receive quite a lot of European Union money, but nevertheless, a number of people who were voting to leave was high. And so this is not really a fact-based thing. This is much more a kind of a worldview, kind of ideological thing about, I would say, taking control. I mean, this is the term that the Brexit people would constantly be bringing up, and it was, taking control of one's country and not being able to come to grips with the kinds of changes that are happening around the world. So in this respect, the Brexit vote might be seen as a kind of revolt against globalization, okay? And that's something very hard, I think, for the political class to get its head around, because I think one of the it's worth keeping in mind that in Parliament, if you actually polled the people in Parliament, so the 600 plus members of the House of Commons, how they voted in the referendum, it's something like close to 4-1, 5-1 in favor of remaining. Okay, these people realize that Britain's future is very much tied to globalization. Okay, and so there is this real disconnect between the view of the people who are elected to represent the people and the people themselves on this matter, and it's a worldview difference. It's not a difference that is based on people really having a good sense of the facts, but rather how they feel about the world in which they're living. And this is not easy to solve. And I think one of the ways you see it's not easy to solve is in fact how the referendum has been treated since it was won by the Leave side. Because, as a few parliamentarians have mentioned already, in fact, this was the first question that was asked of David Cameron when he made his initial declaration to Parliament, reflecting on the results of the EU referendum. The first question, which came from Ken Clarke, the former Tory Chancellor, and a person who was a veteran from the Thatcher era, but regarded as kind of a liberal Tory, a kind of wise man, pro-European sort of person. The first question he said is, why doesn't Parliament just ignore this thing? Because referenda in a parliamentary system only has legal standing as a consultative exercise. In other words, referenda are not plebiscites. Referenda do not do anything. They do not force anything on Parliament. Um, Parliament is the sovereign body of government in the United Kingdom. This is like British politics 101, okay? The fact that Parliament is indulging this referendum and treating it as if it's something they're forced to act upon says something about the standing of democracy in this country, namely the extent to which politicians feel they have to, in some sense, make concessions to populism. Okay? Because now, it's true that if Parliament were to say, okay, we had this exercise and we see narrowly that the Leave campaign won, but we believe that it's against the national interest to act on the basis of this vote, and that in a sense we will have to overrule the people. We need to take what the people say into account, so we need to think maybe a little more clearly about immigration and some of the issues on the doorstep that actually motivated people to vote for the Leave campaign. But what we don't need to do is to implement the proposal that was on the ballot. This is perfectly within the right of Parliament to do. But it looks like Parliament is not going to do that. And the only reason I could see is because there is a sense in which democracy is interpreted in a kind of populist way nowadays, and that Parliament feels itself in a somewhat weakened position with regard to public opinion. I think it's true that if Parliament were to nullify the referendum, that there would be kind of political chaos. And there might even be riots, and there might be all kinds of stuff, and there might be calls for a general election and all the rest of it. But I do think that one of the mistakes that the politicians made when they were running this referendum was that they were not completely transparent about the legal standing of a referendum in this country. So instead, people kept on talking about they're enforcing the will of the people, as if the will of the people were sovereign in this country, when in fact it's Parliament. It's interesting. I have a feeling this issue is not going to go away. Of course, it's not a very popular issue to raise right this minute, but I think once we start getting into some more detail about what Brexit entails in terms of how Britain is going to have to renegotiate its sovereignty, all the various kinds of issues it's going to have to entangle itself into, that this will not look like such a free, liberating move as it did initially when people voted for the referendum. And at that point, there may be some motivation to just want to end the thing altogether. That's why I think it's very significant that nobody is talking about starting the clock on Article 50 very quickly. Because if that were to be the case, then we would be on a timetable that would force us out of the EU. But as long as the clock isn't ticking, there is still always the option on the table that Parliament can just nullify the referendum as having no binding standing with regard to how we carry forward.